Welcome to HTML tutorial part 5. If you haven't watched any of the previous parts, links are down in the description if you're interested. Now let's get started with part 5. HTML form. A form will help you gather data from a user. Let's see how we create a form in HTML. A form is created within form tag. Within a form tag, we can define various form elements. Input element. An input is created as an input tag, which does not have a closing tag, requires an attribute type where you can define various of types for an input. I'm going to start with text, which simply gets plain text of a single line from a user. So this is how we define an input element within form element. Label element. A label is created as a label tag. Label text goes in between. Requires an attribute for, which can define the form element. So since we have a for attribute, we can bind that first name to this input by calling an attribute ID and setting the value of first name. So this label element defines this input. So this is how you can bind a label with a form element. In this case, it's input, and this is how we define a label for an input element. An attribute name is also required. Now, name attribute will help us to pass along the value that gets returned from this input to the backend. So, name is a must when you define a form element. Text area element. Text area is basically a multi-line input created as a text area tag. We're going to define ID, attributes, and we're going to also have a label. So as you can see the result here, a text area is basically multi-line input field, and this is how you define text area. Select element. A select is basically a drop-down list where a user can choose from various of options. It is defined within a select tag, and inside you can create number of options for that select. So as you can see the result, this is a drop down list. And this is how you define a select. Within an option tag, you can define value of that option. And value is going to be different for each options. So this is important because a value is something that gets passed through the backend when you submit the form. So each option will have its own value. So this is how you define value attribute within an option tag. Let's go over some more input types that we can have within a form element. We can have input type radio. A radio input type will give you a choice to select. Most common usage of this is for yes or no. So an user can select either yes or no. It's for only getting a single value from a user. For your radio button, the label is defined after the input, since we want to have the text appear after the radio button. Just gonna copy and paste, define. User can only select one value. As you can see, goes from one value to another. So a radio button can be used to get a single value input from a user. And as you can see, the name is similar, but the values are different, meaning since we have the name same, this is basically a group of radio buttons that contain values of yes and no. So this is how you define input type radio. We can also have input type checkbox. Now a checkbox is different than the radio. A checkbox will give an option to select more than one value. So let me show you that. So simply copying and pasting since are all similar, but the content, ideas, name, and values are different in the text. Item 3. So as you can see here, this is our input type checkbox where we can select more than one checkbox. So you can select either 1, 2, or 2, 3, or just 1. So this is how you define input type checkbox. We can have input type reset, which will help us to reset all the form values. So for example, it will basically give you a reset button where you can reset all the form values by clicking on it. So this is how we can have input type reset. We can have button element where we can define type submit, give the value of submit. So this button element submit will be submitting this form since we have the type submit here. Before we hit submit, we do have to define an action within form tag. An action is something that user gets to after submitting the form. So in this case, since we're not using any backend language that is connected within this form, we're just gonna simply go to thank you.html page. And now, after we fill out everything, and hit submit, it will take us to the thank you page. After we submit the form in the URL, we will have all the form values with the name that gets returned. Now, this is a way to pass information to the backend page if you're using something like PHP or ASP. Now, this method is okay for sending non-secure data, but we cannot pass in any sensitive information like password or personal data. In order to pass secure information, we can have an attribute defined within the form tag, and it can have get or post value. Get is basically this where it will append form data into the URL string. Post is for sending the data in a secure way where it will append form data inside the body of the HTTP request. So this is how we define an attribute method within form type. And since we have the post method, we will not get this after we submit the form, since post will return everything in the HTTP request of the body. We have covered a couple of important input types. However, there are still more input types that you can define within HTML form. Let me know if you guys are interested. I can have a separate video on that where I can go over various of input types that you can have within the HTML form. Thank you for watching HTML tutorial part 5. If you want to continue learning, please subscribe to this channel. I will see you next time.